Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. Execution scheduled for federal inmates during the COVID-19 pandemic. Celebrity calls for clemency, concerns, and controversies.
I am really upset, appalled, disgusted by the rush to execute people.
A mother's emotional plea after her daughter's murder. She wants accountability for her 8-year-old's death.
Kids are dying because you guys are not doing your jobs.
Plus, a mother's dismembered remains found on the property of her estranged husband's family. Why her accused killers want evidence tossed out of a case.
You can't break the law to enforce the law.
Law and Crime Daily covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome everyone to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Brian Buckmire along with Terri Austin. 2 federal inmates are scheduled to be executed despite COVID-19 concerns. Law and Crime's Angenette Levy is here to explain.
Brandon Bernard and Alfred Bourgeois are scheduled to be executed this week. Bernard's lawyers have been trying to halt his execution. The 7th Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago has denied a request for an appeal and an emergency stay. This comes as it came out that members of the prison's execution team in Terre Haute, Indiana, have tested positive for COVID-19, and that's leading to more calls to delay these executions.
Reality TV star Kim Kardashian West is backing the effort to save Bernard's life. Kardashian West sent out a new series of tweets asking her followers to tweet President Trump and call the White House to persuade him to commute the sentence. Only President Trump or a federal judge can stop the execution, since the murders of Todd and Stacey Bagley were federal crimes because they happened at Fort Hood. The Bagleys begged for their lives as they were robbed, shot in the head, and set on fire. In one tweet, Kardashian West said Bernard should get life without parole because he was only 18 at the time. He wasn't the shooter, and a former prosecutor on the case and some jurors also support life without parole for him. Former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio, Ben Glassman, handled death-eligible cases. He believes the executions should stop until COVID subsides.
My reaction to that is that the Bureau of Prisons has had a horrible time dealing with COVID, as you could imagine. And so I don't understand from a criminal justice perspective why you would be engaging in activities that are not time sensitive, that further endanger BOP staff or other inmates with the spread of COVID if you didn't have to. So I guess I don't understand why it's so important from the department's perspective to move forward on these executions at this time.
The Associated Press has reported that 5 of the execution team members that contracted COVID and have recovered will carry out this week's executions. Now, we spoke with David Singleton. He is the head of the Ohio Justice and Policy Center. He doesn't believe these executions should be happening at all, but in light of COVID, he believes they should be stopped.
I was not surprised to hear that federal executions would begin again under the Trump administration. I was disappointed, not surprised, but the rush, the speed by which they are working to execute people is breathtaking. And that should not be happening. I mean, people are getting execution dates thrown at them really quickly. Lawyers aren't having enough time to seek clemency and pursue last-ditch efforts to save their clients' lives. And so there's just no need for this.
Now, as I mentioned, a former federal prosecutor who worked to uphold Brandon Bernard's death sentence now says he should get life without parole.
Young men are different. They act impulsively. They do not consider consequences. They are easily led by a leader. And that's what happened to Mr. Bernard. If you look at the facts of this case, he did not play near the role that the government said he did or pushed that he did. He received the death penalty largely because he was an adult.
Now, a Justice Department lawyer said earlier this week that it's really impossible to know how those execution team members contracted COVID-19. He said they could have picked it up in many different places. Now, earlier today, I reached out to both the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons. So far, my emails have not been returned. President-elect Joe Biden, meanwhile, has said he will work to end federal executions. Brian, we'll send it back to you.
Thanks, Angenette. The hope is that we can maybe press pause there and get some more information on that case before the death penalty is executed. Joining me now is former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi, along with Terri Austin. Terri, let's start with you. It's down to the wire for Bernard's execution. What arguments, if any, do you think could save his life at this point?
You know, it really is down to the wire, and I think the best arguments have already been made. The fact that he was 18 when this crime occurred, and also the fact that he did not actively participate in the actual murder, that should have been enough to spare his life. If, in fact, both victims died from the gunshot wounds to the head and no one died from the smoke, then I think life in prison would have been justified.
Now, Gene, they are speeding towards an execution, as they said there on the earlier interviews with Angenette. And the country's also turning from the death penalty just in general. Do you think it's time to revisit how clemency is granted to allow a clearer path to receiving it?
Absolutely. I think when we get a new regime on January 20th at the Justice Department, we should revamp the whole pardon process and also the commutation process. Because right now, the perception among the public is that it's very political and it's not what you did, it's who you know. And especially with the death penalty, individuals are getting commuted for lesser crimes, but someone like Mr. Bernard, who is now being asked, who is being supported by 5 jurors, 2 former prosecutors, he wasn't a shooter, he was 18 at the time. I think in his case, it screams for a commutation.
Exactly, and hopefully those screams are heard because, again, like you said, it's down to the wire. Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, we break down the court hearing of a deadly custody dispute. Plus, why a mother is calling for accountability in her daughter's death after the break. An Illinois mother is suing the state and the Department of Children and Family Services after her daughter died of abuse. 8-year-old Rika Rountree was killed in 2018 from being kicked in the stomach so hard it tore her intestines. DCFS placed Rika with her biological father, allegedly ignoring reports of abuse from the girl and her school. His girlfriend, Cynthia Clay, was convicted of murdering Rika and is serving a life sentence. Her father, Richard Rountree, is serving 8 years for child endangerment. Disturbing videos capture the abuse that her mother says happened for years.
Even DCFS wasn't even listening to the school. I mean, my daughter's got black eyes, broken teeth. She's got her hair shaved. She's sitting in class, you know, limped over, like in the teacher's words, an 80-year-old woman. Just not being able to move, you know, the psychological, you know, that she went through talking to DCFS. Like, these are supposed to be people that are supposed to protect our children. And there's no way that you can look at my child before and after and tell me that everything in between was okay.
Rika's mother says the lawsuit isn't about damages, it's about accountability.
Rika's going to leave a legacy. Her death was not for nothing. Every lick she took, every piece of pain she endured, every second of her miserable last years are going to be for something. I need changes. I need policy changes. I need people that are in these positions to do their jobs, act like they care. And then I'm left in this position knowing that for 2.5 years, I fought Luther tooth and nail, damn near lost my sanity, trying to get somebody to listen to me to save my daughter's life, only to have her die weeks after DCFS seen her. There's no way this should have ever happened.
RICA's mother's attorneys announced state and federal lawsuits.
RICA had dozens of scars on her back and torso, scars and abrasions to her face and neck, scarring on her upper left thigh from cigarette burns, and bruises literally all over her body. There is a willful and wanton disregard for the well-being of innocent children. No lawsuit will ever bring RICA back to her mother and her brothers and her family. But at some point, a line must be drawn somewhere telling the state of Illinois that enough is enough.
Back with me are attorneys Gene Rossi and Terri Austin. Gene, you heard Benjamin Crump list the number of injuries there, but the DCF says the claims were, of abuse at least, were unfounded at the time. How can an agency have failed so badly to identify these injuries?
It's a combination of two things, in my view: lack of training, adequate training, and also callous disregard. When an agency drops the ball and allows this horrible murder, if you will, happen to this beautiful young girl, it's a failure of the agency in terms of training people on how to detect incidents of child abuse. And there was a level of uncaring, if you will, on the part of the agency. And just because the agency's mission is to protect the kids doesn't mean that everybody in that agency has the skill set or the passion for their job. I worked in the federal government for a long time. There are many people who are great in doing their job, and then there are some who shouldn't be working for the government.
Now, Terri, I've seen cases like this. I mean, we both have seen cases like this. I think it's going to be a successful one. But tell us how this lawsuit is going to protect future children.
Well, let's hope that, as Gene said, it's going to protect future children, because there will be a change in policy. We know that there will be, hopefully, some financial reward as far as, RICA is concerned and her family is concerned. But I am hoping that we see changes and that we see training and that we see policy changes so that they follow up on reports of abuse. They look more closely when they see children who actually have injuries, that they go back, they report that, they talk to the doctors, and they do something about it. So I think Gene hit it on the head. We have to make sure that they're trained.
And here's the hope that RICA's legacy can be that for Illinois, a change in policies to help other children. Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, a father and son accused of murder. The legal battle their defense is raising to get evidence thrown out. Continuing coverage of a hearing for 3 members of a family charged in the murder of a Florida mother. Nicole Montalvo disappeared last year after dropping her son off at the home of her estranged husband, Christopher Otero Rivera. He and his father, Angel Rivera, are charged with murder. His mother, Wanda Rivera, is charged with being an accessory. The defense says investigators initially obtained a search warrant for a missing persons case. Her dismembered remains were found on the Rivera's property, and her car was found abandoned miles down the road.
We noticed the dome light inside the vehicle was on, and the door was propped open. It wasn't closed entirely. As we were documenting the position of the car and how it was when we located it, behind the trunk area, right to the right of the passenger tire, there was a blue latex glove.
Was that the only latex glove you found?
No, across the street on the same side as Big Sky, but there's a 2-way road. So one's an entrance and one's an exit, but they're side by side. There's just a grass median. On the other side of the outgoing back to 192, there was another latex, blue-colored latex glove there as well. And it was directly the same locations where the car was, just on the other side of the road.
On cross, the defense was quick to point out what evidence wasn't collected from the victim's car.
Well, by our definition, that would be an abandoned vehicle. There's no one around it. There's nobody near it. So that would classify as under ours as an abandoned vehicle.
Fair enough. Are you the person that collected those gloves?
Yes.
And you submitted that into evidence?
Correct.
And did you subsequently learn that there was just no evidence on those gloves that were tied to anyone in the Rivera family?
I have no idea what the results were from those gloves.
Okay, fair enough. There's also tire marks there. Do you see that?
Correct.
By any chance, did you collect those tire marks to try to compare it to any vehicle at the Rivera family?
No, my role at that point, because that was a secondary glove that we found, it was just a matching one to the same one that we found directly behind the car.
Okay, but back to the tire marks, you didn't collect them?
No.
Correct.
On redirect, prosecutors asked why the vehicle appeared suspicious.
It wasn't directly off of 192. There was some major distance from, like, if you had an issue or stopped, you're normally going to stop a lot closer to 192 in that area. This is a little bit further of a normal distance, off the roadway.
Did you all run the tag and confirm that that the vehicle belonged to Nicole Montalvo?
Correct. When I was pulling in behind Lieutenant Maroney, he was reading me. When I walked up to his car, he just got the return back from the tag he ran, and it was explained to me who it belonged to.
When we come back, a mother missing, then found dead. Why investigators knew right away to look at her estranged husband next. Back now to a Florida hearing where the defense for 3 suspects in a murder case want evidence tossed out. A search for Nicole Montalvo began in October of 2019 when she failed to show up for work. Law enforcement immediately turned their sights to her estranged husband, Christopher Otero Rivera. Police thought she was kidnapped, then realized she had been murdered. But the defense says investigators were deceitful when requesting their original search warrant.
They spread out through the home, whether they didn't take pictures or open drawers. They were not looking for little pieces of evidence. What they were looking for was Nicole Montalvo at the residence? Was her car at the residence? Whether you want to call it a warrantless search or not, they were there. And what they came out of the residence with was there was no signs of Nicole Montalvo. There was no vehicle of Nicole Montalvo. But they don't include that in the affidavit. St. Cloud Police Department was there. What they got from St. Cloud and Deputy Decker was a conversation with Mr. Rivera, who said, yeah, hey, Nicole Montalvo was here. She was here on October 21st. She dropped off Elijah Rivera, and then she left. And a couple of hours later, I get a text message. He shows them that text message. It's not what we learned later. It's what they knew at the time.
Prosecutors say investigators had plenty of probable cause and cited a history of violence from the defendant towards the victim.
The defendant, Christopher Otero Rivera, he was on community control for a 2018 incident that he had an active domestic violence injunction against him for trying to suffocate the victim and trying to break her neck because she was trying to take custody of their son and because she had been, quote, texting with a friend. We also knew that within a few months of her disappearance, Miss Montalvo had begun dating a new person. We also knew that Miss Montalvo's relationship with the defendant and the co-defendants had become strained because of custody issues. The affidavit bears all these facts out. We also knew that the defendant and the co-defendant, Angel Rivera, had blackmailed the victim, threatening to release nude photos of her over custody issues with the child.
Since this hearing was a motion from the defense, they got the final word.
You can't break the law to enforce the law. The state is basically telling you, forget about the Fourth Amendment. We had someone missing. They had a right to go in there. No, they didn't. They have to establish that they had probable cause, and they didn't do that. It sounds more like where the state is asking you, for some sympathy here. Like, hey, listen, we had this woman missing. They had to do, this is what they had to do. No, they had to work within the confines of the law, and they didn't.
All right, so let's break this down. Terry, the defense is getting creative in their arguments, saying there was a lack of specificity and a belief that a kidnapping actually occurred. Do those arguments persuade you in any way?
You know, Brian, I was not persuaded, but I think they made a good argument. Listen, defense attorneys, they have an ethical duty to provide effective representation to the defendant at all times, as you know, as a defense attorney. But the most damning evidence against the defendant is obviously the victim's body parts, which were found on the defendant's property. So the defense attorney is going to have to argue as best they can that this evidence should not be admitted. And they did argue that there was no reason to actually search the outside of the house. And so I think it's the best argument they could have made.
Now, Gene, prosecutors argued saying that Montalvo's cell phone was actually in the area at the time of the disappearance, and that's why they had the right to search. Who loses this argument and why?
Well, here's the main argument of the defense. It's a case called Leon versus United States. And what it says is that if the officer who gets the affidavit for the search warrant or gets a search warrant, in good faith relies on that search warrant, and later on a judge says that the search warrant is not valid, then that search is good. So what we have here is when they went to the magistrate judge or the judge with the affidavit, were there misleading pieces of information, the location of the car, the location of her cell phone? Was there significant omissions of exculpatory information in the affidavit? Were they trying to mislead the approving judge with their affidavit? If that happened, then this search should be oppressed. And what that defense attorney said,
and we'll see how that goes, Jeannie.
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Gene. I know we could go on for days, but thank you for joining us here on Law and Crime Daily. See you next time to discuss justice in America.